Joining us right now in the studio is Lara Alqasem's lawyer, Leora Bechor, and Israel's former Deputy Foreign Minister, Danny Ayalon. Welcome, both of you. Thanks very much for being here. Danny, let me start with you. Reacting to what we just heard from Tzipi Livni, she says, why not let her into Israel to actually learn about the reality of Israel, and that this decision, the way this all played out, is doing much more harm than good to Israel in the first place?
Well, she certainly has a point, by the way, but also the government. And I believe what the government has done is just following the Israeli law. We have to remember that the boycott movement is not just about pressuring Israel or trying to change the policy of the government vis-a-vis settlements or vis-a-vis anything else. It is a movement which is dedicated for the destruction of the state of Israel. All you have to do is look at their publications and at their battle cry. What is their battle cry? Is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. No room for Israel. So every state which is sovereign and certainly democratic like Israel, they can just try to enforce their own laws and legislation, and certainly question people who come here as provocateurs. I'm not talking about Lara necessarily, but I think this is also a message, because there has been a constant flow of infiltrations, if you will, to come and to try to harass Israeli soldiers, bring cameras, and again to shame and to embarrass Israel. And you know that Israel is standing against a very, very, I would say, ruthless political battle against it.
Lara, I want to give you, Leora, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of Danny's comments, but I'd also like to hear from you how Lara is feeling, especially considering what we've just saw about these pamphlets and posters at Hebrew University.
Well, first of all, she's very tired.
I can imagine.
She spent 17 days in detention, so she's really trying to get her energy back and throw herself into her studies. She started yesterday, and she's already fallen behind. She missed a week of school, and a week in the law faculty at Hebrew U. It's a lot of material to catch up on. And she's trying to not focus on the attention and on the negative attention from Im Tirtzu in this case.
And do you have a response to some of what Danny has just said about defending the government and the law in this case?
Lara's case isn't about the constitutionality of the law, whether it's not about the boycott law, but about the application of the law to this particular person. And that if we deny entry into Israel in an absolute fashion, then we're creating a thought police. So it's not about the provocateur, the person who goes to the checkpoint, the person who publishes a damning BDS report on Israel. It's about the person who has legitimate criticism of Israel, who arrives at the border and is denied entry.
And Danny, in this case, the Supreme Court did rule with Leora's client, with Lara Alqasem, that she has the right to enter. So we're talking about a very, very volatile and fine line. How do you decide what is considered a real danger to Israel that should qualify as part of this law, or someone like Lara?
Well, that's why you have the competent authorities, whether it's police or other intelligence agencies, to look into the matter.
Do you think they did that in this case, that the Israeli government was the competent authority in this case?
Probably yes, but I also say that I'm very proud of Israel's checks and balances as a great democracy, and everybody respects here the decision of the Supreme Court. The government could have asked for to appeal for a larger bench.
Yes, right.
Yeah, but they didn't, and they respect it. And I think no other country in the area would have done the same.
I want to say that. I want to ask you about that appeal. Is that something, do you think the government may yet still appeal on this case, or do you think that's a...
They've decided not to appeal. When the decision came down, she wasn't going to be automatically released. The detention facility needed the approval, the authorization of the prosecutor's office to know whether they were appealing or not, because if they were to appeal, they would have also asked for a stay of her release.
Do you think the government has learned a kind of lesson about the application of this law, or it's just simply said, okay, this one we didn't get, but we're still going to continue as much and spread it as wide as we have in the past?
I think time will tell, but if we look at the comments made by the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Strategic Affairs, appears quite clear that they haven't learned the lesson.
They have not learned the lesson,
and the law will continue to be misapplied.
So you're referencing Minister of Interior Aryeh Deri, and Danny, Deri said, "I intend to examine how to prevent this incident from setting a precedent," meaning he wants to step up the application of this law, make sure that a BDS supporter is not let in the future. What do you think about the Israeli government going further down this road, even further than the current law?
Well, Nurit, first of all, I think there is a lesson to learn, and I hope the Israeli government is looking into it, and you have to check it. I mean, it's not just a blanket law. You have to check it case by case. And in some cases, every government, everyone can be wrong every once in a while, but certainly Israel has the right to check into and admit to Israel anyone which they fit will not damage or will not undermine Israel's security, legitimacy, or anything like that.
I want you to respond. I know that wasn't in Lara's case because she said it applied, but if you could just speak to Danny's point, what is your reaction to what he just said?
So firstly, the question of the constitutionality of the law was not addressed in our case. It's going to be addressed in another case.
I'm asking you about
and then, so I believe that the law is unconstitutional and that it is restriction of free speech, that the government isn't able to exercise its discretion. If we had a government authority that really looked on a case-by-case basis and was able to exercise judgment and say, this case, the person falls under the law, in this case, they don't. But that's not what happens. What we see is absolute power, an exercise of the law on people who are very far from the purview of the law. If I may, the law was then clarified by regulations of the Ministry of Interior. So the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Strategic Affairs, they themselves said and put down in writing a policy statement that said the law, yes, we agree the law is too broad. It should only apply to a small category of people. That category are the major players, the major BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction activists, and people who are acting on behalf of those organizations who it's basically almost their full-time job to work on BDS issues. On one hand, they publish this statement, which is policy for all intents and purposes, and on the other hand, they say, that said, Lara is still a BDS activist. It doesn't fit. You can't have it both ways.
Danny, isn't there a bit of a disconnect here? And this isn't the first time that Israel has tried to stop somebody who is a supporter of the BDS movement in one way or another from entering the country.
There could easily be a disconnect. We have to remember Israel is the government here is a coalition government, and ministers here are also politicians, and they have to also, let's say, cater, pander, whatever you want to say, to their own constituents, and this is also a factor that should not be overlooked. Israel is a democracy, and I would say that about the freedom of speech, and any Israeli can say anything they want. I think Israel is more democracy in this case than any other country. I don't think any other country in the Congress of the United States, I don't think that a member of Congress could have gone up and from the pulpit.
Danny, with continuing this law, if you have Israel, and you've been in positions, several positions in government where you've had to explain and defend Israel, when you are preventing somebody from coming inside Israel who has, Facebook posts even about Israel, will it not become more difficult to defend the democracy you describe? Are you not making your life more difficult?
It is a challenge, absolutely. And here, again, I do not know. We have to look into the decision makers and what was in front of them when they made the decision.
Let me just ask you, Leora, the question, the BDS movement, and you said it, describing it as thought police. Doesn't a government have the right to deny entry to people that it feels are trying to undermine it, even if it's done, even if it's a verbal expression? There are plenty of governments who do it.
No, the answer is no, not in a democracy. And Israel itself said the answer is no. They wouldn't have published the guidelines had they thought that there was a problem with restricting thought. So they themselves acknowledged that there has to be a line. And the line is the activist. What the law was created to prohibit was the person who's coming to Israel to do BDS work on the ground.